The autumn rain drummed against the mullioned windows of the Whitmore estate as Margaret stepped through the mahogany front doors for what she believed might be the last time. The mansion that had been her home for the past 3 years felt foreign now, its familiar warmth replaced by an Arctic chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Where are you watching this story unfold from today? I always love hearing from viewers around the world who connect with stories of justice and family drama. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 2 in the afternoon, its bronze chimes echoing through halls that seemed to absorb sound differently now that Theodore was gone. Margaret clutched her worn leather purse tighter, feeling the weight of the simple gold band on her finger. 3 years. Such a brief time to call this place home. Yet every room held memories that the Whitmore children seemed determined to erase. Voices carried from the oak-paneled library where the family had gathered for the reading of Theodore's will. Margaret recognized the sharp tones of Clarissa Whitmore Sterling, Theodore's eldest daughter, whose voice always carried the particular blend of entitlement and disdain that came from 3 decades of private schools and country club membership. Her husband Reginald's deeper baritone provided a steady counterpoint, punctuated by the occasional nasal interjection from middle son Preston and his wife Vivian. Margaret paused outside the library doors, smoothing her simple black dress. The fabric was quality wool, but purchased from a department store rather than the boutiques the Whitmore women favored. She had learned early in her marriage that every choice, from her clothing to her accent, would be scrutinized and found wanting by Theodore's children. The conversation inside grew clearer as she approached. "We should have seen this coming when father married that woman," Clarissa was saying. 3 years of marriage and she thinks she belongs here. The audacity is breathtaking. Reginald's voice rumbled in agreement. The man was grieving and vulnerable. These gold diggers know exactly when to strike. She saw dollar signs the moment she met him at that community college where she was taking night classes. Margaret's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She had grown accustomed to their assumptions about her background, their whispered conversations about the Vietnamese immigrant's daughter who had somehow ensnared their father. They never bothered to learn that her night classes had been in estate planning law, or that she held 2 degrees from respected universities. In their minds, she would always be the cleaning lady's daughter who had seduced a lonely widower. She knocked gently on the door frame before entering. The conversation stopped abruptly as 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity. Clarissa sat in the leather wingback chair that had been her mother's favorite, her blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp planes of her face. At 45, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Margaret," Clarissa said with a smile that never reached her pale blue eyes. "How thoughtful of you to join us. We were just discussing the arrangements for after today." Margaret took the remaining seat, a simple wooden chair that someone had clearly brought in from the dining room. The message was subtle but unmistakable. She noticed that Preston kept glancing at his Rolex, his fingers drumming impatiently against his knee. At 42, he had inherited his father's height, but none of his warmth, his thin face dominated by calculating dark eyes that seemed to measure the monetary value of everything they surveyed. His wife Vivian perched on the arm of his chair like an exotic bird, her auburn hair cascading over one shoulder of her designer dress. She had married into the family 2 years ago and seemed determined to prove her loyalty through increasingly creative displays of cruelty toward Margaret. The youngest of the 3 siblings, Oliver, had positioned himself near the window, his artist's temperament making him uncomfortable with direct confrontation, but not enough to actually defend Margaret. "We want you to know that we understand this must be difficult for you," Clarissa continued in the tone she might use with a confused child. "Losing Theodore so suddenly, and now having to face the reality of your situation. But we want to help you transition back to your life. Your real life," Vivian added with a tinkling laugh. "Away from all this wealth and responsibility that must feel so overwhelming." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene despite the acid burning in her stomach. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" "Well," Preston leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation. "We know father was generous with you during the marriage. He bought you clothes, jewelry, gave you spending money. We certainly don't expect you to return those gifts. Consider them a parting bonus for your years of service." Service. The word hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. Theodore was my husband, not my employer. Reginald laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Come now, let's not pretend this was some grand love story. You were what, 28 when you met him? He was 65 and worth $40 million. The math isn't exactly complicated. The cruelty in his voice was casual, matter-of-fact. Margaret studied his face, noting the weak chin hidden beneath his carefully groomed beard, the soft hands that had never known manual labor, the entitled slouch of someone who had inherited everything and earned nothing. She filed these observations away with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment. Clarissa reached into her purse and withdrew a business card. I've taken the liberty of contacting a placement agency. They specialize in helping women like you find appropriate situations. Housekeeping, companionship for elderly gentlemen. You have experience in both areas. The business card lay on the mahogany coffee table between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Margaret looked at it without moving to pick it up. The silence stretched until Oliver shifted uncomfortably by the window. She's not actually saying anything, he observed nervously. Maybe she's in shock. Shock, Vivian agreed with mock sympathy. The poor thing probably thought she'd hit the jackpot. Marrying a millionaire and living in a mansion must have seemed like a fairy tale. Until reality set in, Preston added. Father's gone now, and the family assets revert to the rightful heirs. His children and grandchildren. People who share his blood and his values. Margaret finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. And you've already decided what those assets are and how they should be distributed. The family exchanged glances laden with meaning. Of course we have, Clarissa said smoothly. We've been managing father's affairs for years. Unlike some people, we understand the responsibility that comes with generational wealth. The clock chimed the half hour, and Margaret realized she had been sitting in this room, absorbing their cruelty, for 30 minutes. 30 minutes of being treated like an obstacle to be removed rather than a woman mourning the loss of her husband. She thought of Theodore's gentle hands, his quiet humor, the way he had looked at her, as if she were a miracle he couldn't quite believe he deserved. These people had no idea who she really was or what she was truly capable of. But they would learn soon enough. The lawyer would arrive within the hour, and then the real education would begin. For now, she simply nodded and rose from her chair with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the conversation. I appreciate your concern for my future, she said softly. I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should. As Margaret left the library, she heard Vivian whisper to Preston behind her. She's taking it better than I expected. Maybe she's finally accepted reality. Margaret allowed herself the smallest of smiles as she climbed the stairs to the bedroom she had shared with Theodore. Reality, she thought, was about to become far more complicated than any of them could imagine. The pharmacy trip had taken longer than expected. Margaret sat in her modest Honda Civic outside the estate gates, staring at the brass keypad that should have recognized the code Theodore had given her 3 years ago. She pressed the familiar sequence again, watching the red light blink mockingly in response. The October wind whipped through the maple trees lining the driveway, sending leaves spiraling across the wrought iron gates like confetti at a funeral. She tried the code a third time before the reality settled into her bones with the weight of inevitability. They had changed it. While she had been collecting Theodore's heart medication from the pharmacy, filling prescriptions that would never be used, his children had already begun erasing her from their father's life. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed the house number. The phone rang 4 times before Clarissa's crisp voice answered with barely concealed irritation. Whitmore Residence, Clarissa speaking. It's Margaret. The gate code isn't working. A pause, then a sound that might have been laughter. Oh dear, how awkward. I suppose we should have mentioned that we've updated the security protocols. For insurance purposes, you understand. The property needs to be secured during the transition period. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. May I please have the new code so I can come home? Home. Clarissa repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This was never really your home, was it? You were a guest here, and now that the circumstances have changed, well, perhaps it's time to make other arrangements. Through the phone, Margaret could hear voices in the background. Preston's laughter carried clearly, followed by Vivian's sharp giggle. They were enjoying this. My clothes are inside, Margaret said quietly. My personal belongings. Items that belong to Theodore and me. Of course, and we've taken care of that for you. Check the lawn, dear. We've been very careful with your things. The call ended with a decisive click. Margaret sat in her car for a long moment, watching her breath fog the windows as the afternoon temperature dropped. Then she drove slowly around to the front of the estate where the circular driveway opened onto manicured lawns that had been Theodore's pride. Her belongings were scattered across the grass like debris from a shipwreck. Dresses hung limply from the branches of the oak tree where Theodore had proposed to her, the fabric already damp from the morning's frost. Books lay open and spine broken, their pages fluttering in the wind like wounded birds. The jewelry box Theodore had given her on their first anniversary sat appended near the fountain, its contents glittering uselessly among the fallen leaves. Margaret parked and walked slowly through the wreckage of her life. Someone had taken particular care to destroy the photograph albums. Images of her wedding day lay torn and scattered, Theodore's gentle smile visible on fragments of glossy paper that would soon dissolve in the approaching rain. The wedding dress she had worn, a simple but elegant creation that Theodore had said made her look like moonlight, hung from the fountain's edge, already stained with mud and grass. The front door of the mansion opened, and Preston stepped onto the flagstone terrace with a brandy snifter in his hand despite the early hour. His expression was one of theatrical concern as he surveyed the scene. Tragic, isn't it? He called out cheerfully. How quickly things can change. One day you're living in luxury, the next you're picking your belongings off the lawn like a common vagrant. Margaret knelt to gather the scattered photographs, her movements methodical and unhurried. She found a picture of Theodore reading in his study, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and slipped it carefully into her purse. You know what I find most amusing about this situation? Preston continued, taking a sip of his brandy. Father actually believed you loved him. The poor old fool convinced himself that a young woman like you could fall for a man old enough to be your grandfather. The delusion was almost touching. Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked up at him with an expression of such calm composure that Preston's smile faltered for just a moment. Your father was a good man who deserved better than children who measure love in dollar amounts, she said quietly. Preston's face darkened. Don't you dare lecture me about my father. You barely knew him. 3 years of playing nursemaid and warming his bed doesn't make you family. You were the help who got ideas above her station, nothing more. The venom in his voice carried clearly across the lawn, and Margaret noticed movement in several of the mansion's windows. The household staff were watching, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes reflecting a mixture of sympathy and fear. Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 20 years, stood at the kitchen window with her hand pressed to her mouth. Margaret began collecting her scattered clothes, folding each item with the same care she would have used in her bedroom upstairs. A cashmere sweater Theodore had bought her for Christmas. The navy dress she had worn to their anniversary dinner. Simple, quality pieces that told the story of a woman who had been loved and cherished, even if only briefly. Vivian appeared beside Preston, her designer heels clicking against the flagstone. She carried a crystal champagne flute and wore the ruby necklace that had belonged to Theodore's first wife. The poor thing looked so lost, Vivian observed with mock sympathy. Like a child who can't find her parents at the shopping mall. Perhaps we should call social services. Preston laughed, the sound sharp in the crisp air. Or animal control. Though I suppose even they have standards about what kind of strays they'll take in. Margaret continued her methodical collection of belongings, placing items carefully in the cardboard boxes that the family had thoughtfully provided. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone completing a necessary but unpleasant task, showing no signs of the humiliation that Preston and Vivian seemed to expect. The strange composure began to unnerve them. Vivian's laughter became more shrill, her comments more desperate for a reaction. I wonder what the country club members will think when they hear about this, Vivian said loudly. The grieving widow reduced to gathering her things from the lawn like a bag lady. It will make quite the story at the charity luncheon tomorrow. Margaret paused in her packing, a silk scarf halfway to the box in her hands. She looked up at Vivian with interest, as if hearing genuinely useful information. You're planning to discuss my situation at the charity luncheon, Margaret asked with what sounded like polite curiosity. Vivian's smile widened. Oh, my dear, it's already the talk of the club. Poor Theodore's unfortunate final marriage. The way you manipulated a lonely old man in his final years. People are simply fascinated by the depths some women will sink to for money. Margaret nodded thoughtfully and resumed her packing. I see. And you've already told them that I've been asked to leave. Not asked, Preston corrected gleefully. Told. There's a difference. We don't negotiate with opportunists and gold diggers. The wind picked up, sending more leaves skittering across the lawn and rustling through Margaret's dark hair. She loaded the last box into her Honda, then turned to face the mansion one final time. Her gaze swept over the windows where she had watched sunrises with Theodore, the garden where they had walked on summer evenings, the terrace where they had shared quiet conversations about books and dreams, and the unexpected gift of finding love late in life. Preston and Vivian waited for tears, for pleading, for some sign that their cruelty had achieved its intended effect. Instead, Margaret simply inclined her head in a gesture that seemed almost regal. Thank you for clarifying my situation so thoroughly, she said with perfect politeness. I'm sure tomorrow's luncheon will be very enlightening for everyone involved. She climbed into her car and drove away without looking back, leaving Preston and Vivian standing on the terrace with the uncomfortable feeling that they had just missed something important. The champagne in Vivian's glass seemed to have lost its sparkle, and Preston found himself draining his brandy in one harsh swallow. By evening, Margaret had checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and weekly rates were available for people whose circumstances had changed suddenly. She sat on the thin bedspread, surrounded by boxes of her salvaged belongings, and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated her face as she began to type, her fingers moving with the confident precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Phone calls needed to be made. Appointments scheduled. Documents retrieved from safety deposit boxes that certain people had never known existed. Margaret Chun had been patient for 3 years, playing the role of grieving widow and grateful recipient of Whitmore charity. But tomorrow would bring the will reading, and with it, the end of her performance. She thought of Preston's ugly laughter, Vivian's cruel smile, Clarissa's dismissive coldness. They had given her exactly what she needed. Their own words, witnessed by the household staff. Their public declarations at the country club. Their absolute certainty about what they believed they deserved and what they thought she was worth. Margaret saved her work and closed the laptop, then lay back on the narrow bed and smiled at the water-stained ceiling. Tomorrow would indeed be very enlightening for everyone involved. The call came at 8 in the morning, 3 days after Margaret's humiliating eviction from the Whitmore estate. She had been sitting in the cramped motel room, nursing her second cup of instant coffee and reviewing documents on her laptop, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Jonathan Pemberton from Pemberton, Hayes & Associates. I was Theodore Whitmore's estate attorney. I apologize for the delay, but there have been some complications with the will execution that require immediate attention. Could you possibly meet with the family this afternoon at 2 o'clock? Margaret set down her coffee cup with steady hands. Of course, Mr. Pemberton. Will this be at your offices? Actually, I'll need to meet at the estate itself. There are property-related matters that require on-site verification. The family has been notified and will be present. After ending the call, Margaret allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had wondered how long it would take for the complications to surface. 3 days was actually longer than she had expected, but then again, Theodore had been meticulous in his planning. Even from beyond the grave, he was protecting her with layers of legal complexity that would take time to unravel. Margaret showered in the motel's narrow bathroom and dressed with particular care. She chose a navy blue suit that Theodore had bought her for their second anniversary, classic and well-cut, but not ostentatious. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, and she wore the pearl earrings that had been her mother's only valuable possession. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman of substance who had temporarily fallen on difficult circumstances. The drive to the estate felt different this time. Margaret punched in the temporary access code that Mr. Pemberton had provided, and the gates swung open with their familiar whisper of expensive machinery. The Honda's tires crunched on the gravel drive, and she noticed that the grounds crew had already cleaned up the debris of her scattered belongings. The lawn looked immaculate, as if yesterday's cruelty had been nothing more than an unpleasant dream. She parked behind a sleek black Mercedes that she didn't recognize and a silver Jaguar that belonged to Clarissa. The family Bentley sat in its usual spot, and Margaret felt a pang of loss remembering how Theodore had taught her to drive it on quiet Sunday mornings, laughing at her nervousness about handling something so expensive. The front door opened before Margaret could knock. Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with an expression of profound relief mixed with something that might have been hope. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore," the older woman whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I'm so glad you're all right. We were all so worried when we saw what they did. It wasn't right, not right at all." "Thank you, Mrs. Henley." Margaret touched the woman's arm gently. "I hope this situation will be resolved soon." "They're all in the library with the lawyer," Mrs. Henley continued in hushed tones. "Been there for an hour already, and I can tell you they're not happy about having to wait for you. Master Preston has been pacing like a caged tiger." Margaret smoothed her skirt and walked toward the library with the measured pace of someone who belonged in these surroundings. The mahogany doors were closed, but she could hear the murmur of agitated voices from within. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. The scene that greeted her was immediately illuminating. A distinguished man in his 60s sat behind Theodore's massive desk, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his charcoal suit obviously bespoke. Legal documents were spread across the leather surface like a battle plan, and his pale blue eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to handling complex estates. This had to be Jonathan Pemberton. The Whitmore children and their spouses occupied the same seats they had claimed 3 days earlier, but their body language had changed dramatically. Preston stood near the window, his face flushed and his hands clenched into fists. Clarissa sat rigidly in her mother's chair, her composure cracked just enough to reveal the anxiety beneath. Vivian perched on the edge of her seat like a bird ready for flight, while Reginald studied his manicured fingernails with studied indifference. Oliver remained by the bookshelves, but his artist's sensitivity made him appear almost ill. "Ah, Mrs. Whitmore." Mr. Pemberton rose and extended his hand with professional warmth. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the unusual circumstances, but as I was just explaining to the family, your late husband's estate presents some unique challenges that require careful navigation." Margaret shook his hand and took the wooden chair that had been brought in for her during the previous meeting. She noticed immediately that it had been replaced with one of the leather chairs from Theodore's study, a subtle but significant upgrade that made Clarissa's mouth tighten with displeasure. Mr. Pemberton resumed his seat and picked up a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "Now then, as I was saying before Mrs. Whitmore arrived, Theodore's will is quite comprehensive, but it references several pre-existing legal instruments that significantly impact the distribution of assets. These instruments were executed over the past decade and require careful examination." Preston stepped forward impatiently. "Look, Mr. Pemberton, we appreciate your thoroughness, but this seems unnecessarily complicated. Father's assets pass to his children according to the standard provisions. How difficult can it be?" Mr. Pemberton's smile was polite but cold. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been practicing estate law for 35 years, and I can assure you that nothing about your father's arrangements could be considered standard. In fact, they represent some of the most sophisticated estate planning I've encountered." He opened the document and adjusted his reading glasses. "Let me begin with the most straightforward bequest. To my dear children Clarissa, Preston, and Oliver, I leave my deepest love and the knowledge that they will always be cared for according to their true needs and character." The silence that followed was deafening. Vivian was the first to break it, her voice rising to a near shriek. "That's it. Love and knowledge. What about the money, the properties, the investments?" Mr. Pemberton turned several pages. "Those assets, Mrs. Whitmore, were disposed of through other legal mechanisms over the past several years. Mechanisms that your late father-in-law executed with considerable foresight and planning." Clarissa leaned forward, her voice sharp with panic. "What kind of mechanisms? What are you talking about?" "Trusts, primarily. Revocable and irrevocable instruments designed to protect the estate from taxation and ensure proper stewardship. Your father was quite concerned about the responsible management of generational wealth." Preston's face was turning purple. "Responsible management. Those are our family assets. Our inheritance. You can't just give them away to trusts. Mr. Pemberton's expression remained professionally neutral. Mr. Whitmore, the assets weren't given to trusts. They were transferred to a specific beneficiary through trust mechanisms. A beneficiary your father selected based on extensive evaluation of character, competence, and commitment to the family's true values. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Vivian's sharp breathing. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the family's growing comprehension with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment. Who? Clarissa whispered. Who is the beneficiary? Mr. Pemberton smiled for the first time since Margaret had entered the room. Mrs. Margaret Chin Whitmore, your stepmother and your father's wife of 3 years. The explosion of protest was immediate and chaotic. Preston lunged forward as if he might physically attack the lawyer. Clarissa's voice rose to a shriek of denial. Reginald began shouting about fraud and undue influence, while Vivian dissolved into hysterical tears. Only Oliver remained silent, staring at Margaret with something approaching awe. Mr. Pemberton raised his hand for silence, and when the family continued their outcry, he spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. Enough. These arrangements were executed legally and properly, with multiple witnesses and notarizations. They are entirely valid and binding. He pulled out a thick manila folder and spread additional documents across the desk. Let me be specific about the scope of these transfers. The Whitmore mansion and its grounds were transferred to Mrs. Whitmore through an irrevocable trust established in January of 2015, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Preston sputtered. That's impossible. Father wasn't even divorced from Mother yet. He didn't meet her until 3 years ago. Mr. Pemberton consulted his notes with professional precision. Actually, Mr. Whitmore, your father first met Mrs. Chun in January of 2014 when she was completing her law degree with a specialization in estate planning. She was recommended to him by Professor Williams at the university as an exceptionally promising student who might be interested in assisting with some complex trust work. Margaret spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice calm and clear. I spent 18 months helping your father reorganize his estate structure. The trust work was quite complex, involving tax implications and long-term asset protection strategies. You're a lawyer, Clarissa said flatly. You never told us you were a lawyer. Margaret tilted her head slightly. You never asked. You assumed I was an uneducated gold digger and treated me accordingly. I saw no reason to correct your assumptions. The simple statement hung in the air like a blade. Reginald stood abruptly, his face red with fury. This is fraud. Undue influence. A conspiracy between you and Father to steal our inheritance. We'll contest this in court. Mr. Pemberton's smile turned positively glacial. Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Whitmore holds a law degree from Georgetown University with highest honors. She completed her master's in estate planning at Harvard. She has been a member of the Virginia State Bar for 8 years. I hardly think you'll find a court willing to declare that such a person was incapable of advising your father on legal matters. He pulled out another document. Furthermore, every transfer was reviewed and approved by 3 independent attorneys, witnessed by multiple parties including bank officers and notaries, and executed only after mandatory waiting periods to ensure your father's clear intent. Mrs. Whitmore actually advised against several of the transfers, suggesting they were unnecessarily generous. But why? Oliver spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible. Why would Father do this? Margaret looked at the youngest Whitmore sibling with genuine sympathy. Because your father was a wise man who understood the difference between loving his children and enabling their worst impulses. Because he wanted to ensure that the family wealth would be preserved and used responsibly rather than squandered on luxury and self-indulgence. She stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. Because he knew that giving you unlimited access to money would destroy you, just as it has destroyed so many families before yours. The trust arrangements ensure that you will be cared for according to your genuine needs, but only if you demonstrate the character and wisdom he hoped you would develop. Preston's voice cracked with desperation. You manipulated him. You seduced a lonely old man and convinced him to betray his own children. Margaret's expression remained serene. Your father was 71 when we married, Preston. He had full possession of his faculties and 30 years of experience managing complex business affairs. Do you really believe a man of his intelligence and experience could be manipulated so easily? Mr. Pemberton gathered his papers with brisk efficiency. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. There are additional complications regarding the other assets that will require further review. Mrs. Whitmore, I'll need to schedule several meetings with you over the coming weeks to complete the transfer processes. Additional complications, Vivian whispered. What other assets? Mr. Pemberton's smile was positively enigmatic. We'll address those matters in due time. For now, I suggest everyone process today's revelations thoroughly. Mrs. Whitmore, as the legal owner of this property, you'll need to make decisions about its ongoing management and occupancy. The words hit the family like physical blows. Clarissa gripped the arms of her chair as if the furniture might anchor her to a reality that was shifting beneath her feet. Preston stared at Margaret with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. Even Reginald seemed stunned into silence. Margaret gathered her purse and stood with quiet dignity. I'll be in touch, Mr. Pemberton. Thank you for handling this so professionally. As she walked toward the library doors, she paused and turned back to face the family that had treated her with such cruelty just days before. The balance of power in the room had shifted so completely that the very air seemed different. I'll give you time to process this information, she said softly. When you're ready to discuss the future in a civilized manner, you know how to reach me. The massive doors closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the Whitmore family sitting in the ruins of their expectations and the growing realization that they had gravely underestimated the quiet woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a fortune-hunting interloper. The emergency family meeting convened at 10 o'clock the following morning, with Mr. Pemberton arriving precisely on time, carrying an additional briefcase and wearing the grave expression of someone about to deliver terminal news. Margaret had spent the night in a suite at the Fairmont Hotel, having decided that returning to her motel room would be unnecessarily dramatic. She arrived at the estate in a black sedan that Mr. Pemberton had arranged, stepping out with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The family had clearly not slept well. Preston's hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled from a night of anxious pacing. Clarissa sat rigid in her chair, her makeup applied with shaking hands that had left visible streaks of foundation along her jaw. Vivian clutched a tissue box as if it were a life preserver, her eyes red and swollen from tears. Even Reginald's usual arrogance had cracked, replaced by the hollow stare of someone calculating rapidly diminishing options. Mr. Pemberton settled behind Theodore's desk with the methodical precision of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. He opened both briefcases and arranged documents in neat stacks, each movement deliberate and final. Yesterday's revelations regarding the mansion were merely the beginning, he announced without preamble. Your father's estate planning was far more comprehensive than a single property transfer. What I'm about to share represents the full scope of Theodore's financial arrangements, executed over a period of nearly 10 years. He lifted the first document, a thick-bound portfolio stamped with the seal of Pemberton, Hayes and Associates. Let us begin with the investment portfolio. Theodore's stock holdings, valued at approximately $12 million, were transferred to the Margaret Chin Whitmore Trust in March of 2016. Preston shot to his feet as if propelled by electric shock. March 2016. That was 2 years before father even proposed to her. How is that possible? Mr. Pemberton consulted his notes with professional detachment. Your father had been working with Mrs. Whitmore on estate restructuring for over 2 years by that point. She had identified significant tax vulnerabilities in his portfolio structure and recommended protective measures. The transfers were part of a sophisticated asset protection strategy. Margaret spoke quietly from her chair, her voice carrying the authority of someone explaining technical concepts to laypeople. Your father's investments were poorly diversified and legally exposed. 3 of his major holdings were facing potential litigation that could have consumed significant portions of the estate. The trust structure protected those assets while maintaining their growth potential. Clarissa's voice cracked with desperation. You're talking about our family money. Generations of Whitmore wealth that you've somehow stolen. Not stolen, Mr. Pemberton corrected sharply. Legally transferred through properly executed instruments. Mrs. Whitmore's recommendations saved the family estate from potential losses that could have exceeded $20 million. Her expertise quite literally preserved the wealth you're so concerned about. He turned to the next document. The Hamptons property, valued at $4.7 million, transferred to the trust in September 2016. The Colorado Ski Lodge, valued at $2.1 million, transferred in January 2017. The vineyard in Napa Valley, valued at $6.8 million, transferred in June 2017. Each revelation hit the family like a physical blow. Vivian began sobbing openly, her carefully maintained composure dissolving entirely. "That's where we spend Christmas," she wailed. "Preston proposed to me at the ski lodge. Those aren't just properties, they're our memories." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "The properties remain available for family use, subject to appropriate arrangements and respectful conduct. Nothing prevents you from continuing to enjoy them if you can demonstrate the maturity to appreciate them properly." Oliver found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "What about the business holdings? Father's companies?" Mr. Pemberton's smile was grimly satisfied. "I was hoping someone would ask about those. Whitmore Industries, Whitmore Development Corporation, and Whitmore Holdings LLC were restructured through a series of complex transactions between 2017 and 2019. Mrs. Whitmore now holds controlling interests in all three entities." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Reginald's pen snapping in his clenched fist. Preston began pacing frantically, his hands pulling at his hair in a gesture that made him look decades younger and infinitely more vulnerable. "Controlling interests," Preston repeated mechanically. "She controls Father's companies. The companies where we work, where we draw our salaries." Margaret nodded with professional calm. "As of this morning, yes. I've been reviewing the operational reports, and I must say I'm quite impressed with how the management teams have maintained performance despite the somewhat irregular executive oversight." The barb was delivered so gently that it took several seconds for its impact to register. When it did, Clarissa's face went white with rage. "Irregular executive oversight. We've been running those companies for years while Father focused on his retirement hobbies." Margaret consulted a tablet that she produced from her purse. "Actually, according to the financial reports I've been reviewing, company performance declined significantly during the periods when family members assumed increased responsibility. Revenue dropped 12% in 2019, 18% in 2020, and profit margins decreased by nearly 30% overall." She looked up with the expression of someone delivering purely factual information. Fortunately, the professional management teams implemented corrective measures that restored stability. The companies are now quite profitable again, though they require more strategic oversight than they've been receiving. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Whitmore has requested a comprehensive review of all executive compensation packages and performance metrics. She's particularly interested in ensuring that salaries align with actual contributions to company success." The implication hung in the air like a sword. Preston stopped pacing and turned to face Margaret with something approaching panic. "You can't just fire us. We're family. We have contracts." "Employment contracts," Margaret corrected mildly, "subject to standard performance provisions and company restructuring clauses. I haven't made any decisions about personnel changes, but I do intend to implement more rigorous accountability measures." Mr. Pemberton pulled out another set of documents. "We haven't yet addressed the banking arrangements. Theodore's personal accounts, totaling approximately $3.4 million, were transferred to Mrs. Whitmore's control in December 2019. The family trust accounts, containing an additional $8.7 million, were restructured with Mrs. Whitmore as primary trustee." Vivian's sobbing intensified. "That's our money, our security. How are we supposed to live?" Margaret's voice remained steady and reasonable. "The same way most people live, Vivian. Through productive work, careful budgeting, and responsible financial planning. The difference is that your income will now need to be earned rather than simply inherited." She stood and walked to the window that overlooked the estate grounds where her belongings had been scattered just days before. The irony was not lost on any of them. "I want you all to understand something," Margaret continued, her back still turned to the room. "Your father didn't do this to punish you. He did it because he loved you enough to try to save you from yourselves. He watched each of you become increasingly entitled, increasingly disconnected from the value of honest work, increasingly dependent on wealth you hadn't earned. She turned to face them, and for the first time since entering the room, her composure showed cracks that revealed genuine emotion beneath the professional facade. Theodore spent hours talking about each of you, your talents, your potential, your fundamental goodness that had been buried under layers of privilege and expectation. He hoped that removing the safety net might force you to discover who you really are beneath the trust fund cushioning. Clarissa found her voice, though it emerged as a croak. And if we can't, if we fail without the family money, then you'll have the same chance at redemption that millions of people face every day, Margaret replied simply. The opportunity to build something meaningful through your own efforts. The satisfaction of earning respect rather than demanding it. The knowledge that your success belongs to you because you created it yourself. Mr. Pemberton began gathering his documents with the brisk efficiency of someone whose work was nearly complete. There are additional details regarding the transition processes, tax implications, and legal technicalities. Mrs. Whitmore, I'll need you to sign various transfer documents and establish new banking relationships for the consolidated assets. He paused and looked directly at the family with something approaching sympathy. I should mention that Mrs. Whitmore has declined Theodore's suggestions for truly punitive measures. The original estate plan included provisions that would have left each of you with a modest monthly allowance contingent on demonstrated employment and responsible behavior. She insisted on more generous arrangements that preserve your dignity while encouraging independence. Preston's voice was hollow with defeat. How generous? Margaret answered before Mr. Pemberton could respond. Each of you will receive a severance package equivalent to 6 months of your current salary. Your health insurance will be maintained for 1 year. The family properties remain available for special occasions and holidays, subject to advanced scheduling and appropriate conduct. Trust funds for Theodore's grandchildren remain intact and will be managed according to the original provisions. She paused, allowing the information to settle. Additionally, anyone who demonstrates genuine commitment to productive employment and responsible financial management will be eligible for performance-based bonuses and eventual profit sharing in the family businesses. This isn't about destroying you. It's about giving you the chance to become the people Theodore always believed you could be. Reginald spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice heavy with bitter resignation. And if we contest this, if we fight you in court, Margaret's smile was sad but firm. Then you'll discover that I spent 3 years learning everything about this family's financial history, business practices, and personal conduct. You'll also discover that Theodore documented his reasons for these arrangements quite thoroughly. His video depositions explaining his decisions are quite compelling, particularly the sections where he discusses specific incidents of financial irresponsibility and entitled behavior. The threat was delivered so gently that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, the fight seemed to drain out of the room like air from a punctured balloon. Mr. Pemberton stood and extended his hand to Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore, shall we retire to the study to complete the remaining paperwork? I believe the family needs some time to process this information privately. As they prepared to leave, Margaret turned back one final time. The house staff will be retained at their current salaries and benefits, she announced. Mrs. Henley, Thomas, and the groundskeeping crew have been loyal employees who deserve security. Unlike some people, they understand the value of honest work and respectful conduct. The doors closed behind them, leaving the Whitmore family sitting in the wreckage of their assumptions and the growing realization that the quiet woman they had dismissed and humiliated now controlled every aspect of their financial future. In the study, Mr. Pemberton shook his head in professional admiration. Margaret, I've seen many estate reversals in my career, but nothing quite like this. Theodore's planning was brilliant, but your execution has been masterful. Margaret sat in the leather chair that had been Theodore's favorite, running her fingers along the worn armrest where his hands had rested during so many conversations about justice, responsibility, and the terrible weight of inherited wealth. He was a good man who deserved better than what his children had become, she said quietly. If this process can help them rediscover their better natures, then it will have been worth the 3 years of playing a role I despised. If not, at least the family wealth will be used for purposes Theodore would have approved of. Outside the study windows, the November afternoon was growing cold, and Margaret could see the first few snowflakes beginning to fall on the estate that was now, indisputably and completely, her home. Margaret arrived at the estate the following Monday morning with a leather briefcase and the quiet determination of someone prepared to complete an unpleasant but necessary task. She had spent the weekend reviewing every detail of the family's conduct over the past 3 years, cataloging each instance of cruelty, dismissiveness, and entitled behavior with the methodical precision of someone building a case. The family had gathered in the morning room, their faces wearing the shell-shocked expressions of people still processing the complete destruction of their assumptions about the world. Margaret noted that Clarissa had abandoned her usual designer attire in favor of a simple black dress that looked suspiciously like something from a department store. Preston appeared to have aged a decade over the weekend, his confident swagger replaced by the nervous energy of someone whose security had vanished overnight. Mrs. Henley served coffee with the ceremonial gravity of someone witnessing a historical moment. The elderly housekeeper had worked for the Whitmore family for 20 years, and her relief at Margaret's vindication was visible in every gesture. Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the county courthouse. "I have some notifications to deliver," she began with professional courtesy. "As the legal owner of this property, I am formally serving you with eviction notices. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." The words struck the room like a physical blow. Vivian began to hyperventilate, clutching the edge of the mahogany table for support. Preston's face flushed red with outrage, but before he could speak, Margaret continued with implacable calm. "Clarissa, you specifically told me that I was never welcome in this house and that I should make other arrangements. You also informed the staff that I was no longer permitted on the property. I'm simply implementing the same standards of hospitality that you demonstrated to me." She turned to Preston with the expression of someone delivering carefully considered justice. "Preston, you publicly stated that I was nothing more than hired help who had gotten ideas above my station. You also called me a common vagrant while I collected my belongings from the lawn. Since you seem to believe that employment status determines one's right to residence, I'm sure you'll understand that your termination from Whitmore Industries, effective immediately, naturally affects your housing situation." Preston's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his usual arrogance replaced by the dawning horror of complete vulnerability. Margaret's attention shifted to Vivian, whose designer clothes and jewelry suddenly seemed like costume pieces in a play that had ended. "Vivian, you took particular pleasure in describing my situation to the country club membership. You assured them that my eviction would make quite the story at the charity luncheon. I thought you might appreciate knowing that I've accepted the position as chairwoman of the club's scholarship committee. My first act will be recommending that the club review its membership standards to ensure they align with actual charitable values rather than inherited wealth." Vivian's sobbing intensified as the implications became clear. The country club had been her entire social world, the foundation of her identity and self-worth. Margaret turned to Reginald with clinical precision. "Reginald, you specifically accused me of manipulating a lonely old man and called our marriage a fraud. You also suggested that my legal education was somehow illegitimate. I've taken the liberty of sharing your comments with the partners at your law firm, along with documentation of your involvement in attempting to overturn legally executed estate instruments. They've expressed concern about having someone of such questionable professional judgment representing their clients." Reginald's face went white as he realized his career was dissolving before his eyes. But Margaret wasn't finished. "The board of Whitmore Industries will meet this afternoon to discuss executive restructuring. Given the company's improved performance under professional management versus family oversight, significant changes are inevitable. Severance packages will be generous but final." The methodical destruction of their lives proceeded with the inexorable precision of a legal proceeding. Each consequence flowed naturally from their own actions and statements, turning their cruelty back on themselves with surgical accuracy. Oliver spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible. "What about the art collection? Father's paintings?" Margaret's expression softened slightly as she looked at the youngest Whitmore sibling. "Oliver, you were the only one who showed any discomfort with your family's treatment of me. The art collection will remain intact, and you'll have access to study and catalog it as you complete your art history degree. Your education trust remains fully funded because your father believed in your talent and potential." The distinction was not lost on the others. Margaret had carefully separated consequences based on individual conduct, rewarding the one family member who had demonstrated basic human decency. She pulled out a final document and placed it on the table with ceremonial gravity. However, I'm prepared to offer an alternative arrangement. Theodore established a family reconciliation provision that allows for the restoration of certain privileges under specific conditions. Hope flickered in their eyes for the first time since the revelations had begun. Each of you will have the opportunity to address the staff, the country club membership, and the broader community that witnessed your treatment of me. You can publicly acknowledge your mistakes, apologize for your cruelty, and commit to demonstrating the character your father hoped you possessed. In return, you'll receive modest but comfortable living arrangements, the opportunity to earn positions within the family businesses based on merit, and the chance to rebuild relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline extended to drowning people. Margaret's voice remained steady as she outlined the terms. The apologies must be specific and genuine. You'll acknowledge that you misjudged my character and qualifications. You'll admit that your treatment of me was cruel and unwarranted. You'll take responsibility for your entitled attitudes and commit to earning your place in this family through character and conduct rather than birthright. Clarissa straightened in her chair, her chin lifting with the stubborn pride that had defined her entire life. We're supposed to humiliate ourselves publicly. Admit we were wrong about a gold-digging fortune hunter who seduced our father. Margaret's smile was sad but final. There's your answer, Clarissa. Even now, facing the complete loss of everything you've taken for granted, you can't bring yourself to acknowledge basic human dignity in someone you consider beneath you. She stood and gathered her papers with the quiet efficiency of someone whose work was complete. The eviction notices are legally binding. Security will be posted tomorrow evening to ensure compliance. Your personal belongings will be packed and shipped to addresses you provide to Mrs. Henley. Preston made one last desperate attempt. This is vindictive. Cruel. You're destroying lives for no reason other than revenge. Margaret paused at the door and turned back with an expression of genuine sadness. Preston, I scattered my belongings on this lawn and threw away my wedding photos. You called me a vagrant and suggested I was barely human. You celebrated my humiliation and planned to use it as entertainment at social gatherings. Her voice remained steady despite the emotion beneath it. I'm offering you comfortable housing, meaningful work, and the chance to rebuild your dignity. The only requirement is that you demonstrate the basic decency your father spent his entire life trying to teach you. If that seems cruel to you, then you've learned nothing from this experience. The door closed behind her with the finality of a verdict rendered and justice served. Through the window, Margaret could see Mrs. Henley directing the groundskeeping crew in their daily maintenance of the estate that would continue to flourish under management that valued both beauty and character. The Whitmore children sat in the ruins of their assumptions, finally understanding that their father's quiet widow had been far more than she appeared, and that their own cruelty had authored the very destruction they now faced. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the rose garden that had been Theodore's pride and joy, watching the spring blooms emerge with the patient satisfaction of someone who had weathered the worst storms and emerged stronger. The estate had never looked more beautiful, its grounds meticulously maintained by a groundskeeping staff who took genuine pride in their work now that their efforts were appreciated rather than taken for granted. Mrs. Henley approached across the flagstone path, carrying a silver tray with the afternoon tea that had become their daily ritual. The housekeeper's steps were lighter now, her face free of the constant tension that had marked her years of serving a family that treated her as invisible furniture. The scholarship committee meeting went well this morning, Mrs. Henley reported with satisfaction. 12 deserving students will receive full university funding this year, including that young woman from the community college where you first met Mr. Theodore. Margaret smiled as she accepted her cup, remembering the nervous 25-year-old student she had been, working 2 jobs to pay for night classes while dreaming of a career in law. Theodore had been guest lecturing on business ethics when Professor Williams had introduced them, describing her as exceptionally promising but struggling financially. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, covering everything from estate planning theory to their shared love of classical music. How different that meeting had seemed from the calculating seduction that Theodore's children had imagined. The truth was far simpler and more beautiful. Two intelligent people discovering an unexpected intellectual and emotional connection that had deepened into profound love over months of working together. "Any word from the family?" Mrs. Henley asked tactfully. Margaret nodded toward a handwritten letter that lay unopened on the garden table. Oliver wrote again, asking if he might visit to see the Monet collection. His art history thesis is apparently focusing on Impressionist techniques in private collections. "And will you see him?" Margaret considered the question while watching a cardinal build its nest in the hedge that bordered Theodore's memorial garden. Oliver had been the only family member to write, his letters carefully formal but carrying undertones of genuine remorse. Unlike his siblings, he seemed to understand that his father's arrangements had been motivated by love rather than vindictiveness. "Perhaps," Margaret said finally. Theodore always believed Oliver had the potential to become something meaningful if he could separate himself from his siblings' toxic influence. A supervised visit might be possible if he demonstrates genuine commitment to his studies and personal growth. Mrs. Henley's expression brightened. "The master always said you had a generous heart beneath that sharp mind. He knew you'd find ways to honor his hopes for the children while protecting yourself from their worst impulses." Through the estate gates, Margaret could see the modest apartment building where Clarissa now lived, a clean but unremarkable complex that housed retired teachers and civil servants. The former debutante had found work as a receptionist at a dental office, a position that required courtesy and patience rather than the imperious demands she had once considered natural rights. Preston had moved to another state entirely, his law career effectively ended by Margaret's careful documentation of his professional misconduct. Last she had heard, he was working as a paralegal in a small firm, learning for the first time in his life what it meant to answer to people who evaluated him based on competence rather than family connections. Vivian had perhaps suffered the most complete transformation. Cut off from the country club social circuit that had defined her existence, she had been forced to confront the shallow emptiness of a life built entirely on spending other people's money. Margaret had heard through Mrs. Henley's networks that she was attending community college, studying to become a teacher. The irony was not lost on anyone that the woman who had mocked Margaret's night school education was now pursuing the very path she had once scorned. Reginald had managed to find a position with a small practice specializing in estate planning, where his experience with complex trusts was valued despite his tarnished reputation. Margaret occasionally saw his name in legal filings, and she noted with professional interest that his work had become more careful and thorough since his humbling experience. The gate intercom chimed softly, and Margaret saw a familiar figure waiting outside the estate entrance. Jonathan Pemberton stood beside his Mercedes, holding a thick folder that undoubtedly contained the quarterly reports she had requested on the family business operations. "The companies are thriving under the new management structure," Mr. Pemberton announced as he joined them in the garden. "Profits are up 30% from last year, and employee satisfaction surveys show marked improvement. Removing the family's interference from day-to-day operations has allowed the professional teams to implement strategies they'd been recommending for years." Margaret nodded with satisfaction. Theodore had suspected that his children's involvement in the businesses was more hindrance than help, but he had struggled with how to address the problem without completely destroying their self-worth. Her solution had been more elegant. Let their own performance speak for itself, while giving them the chance to earn their way back through demonstrated competence. "None of them have applied for the merit-based positions you established," Mr. Pemberton continued. "Pride appears to be more important to them than financial security." Margaret wasn't surprised. The positions she had created would have provided comfortable salaries and meaningful work, but they required starting at entry level and proving oneself through actual achievement. For people who had always believed that birth determined worth, such arrangements were apparently more humiliating than poverty. The estate has received several very generous donations to the Theodore Whitmore Foundation for Educational Excellence, Mrs. Henley added, consulting a leather-bound ledger. "The scholarship fund is now large enough to support 50 students annually, and the literacy program you established has exceeded all enrollment projections." Margaret felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing Theodore's values translated into tangible change in other people's lives. He had dreamed of using the family wealth to create genuine opportunity rather than mere charity, to build bridges between privilege and need that would benefit everyone involved. A year ago, she had been sitting in a motel room, surrounded by the wreckage of her scattered belongings while Theodore's children celebrated their anticipated inheritance. Now she managed one of the region's most successful charitable foundations, oversaw 3 thriving businesses, and lived in peaceful dignity in the home where she and Theodore had shared their happiest moments. The cardinal in the hedge had completed its nest and was now singing with the territorial confidence of a creature that knew its place in the world was secure. Margaret understood that feeling completely. For 3 years, she had played the role of grateful recipient of Whitmore charity, smiling politely while being dismissed and devalued by people who measured worth only in inherited advantages. But patience and careful planning had their own power. Theodore's love had given her the tools to defend herself, and his wisdom had shown her how to use those tools with precision rather than cruelty. The family's own actions had provided the justification for everything that followed, turning their entitlement and arrogance into the instruments of their own downfall. Mrs. Henley began clearing the tea service, her movements efficient and content. She had been promoted to estate manager, overseeing not just the household staff, but the foundation's daily operations as well. After 20 years of being invisible, she now found herself respected and valued for her intelligence and organizational skills. "Will you be dining in tonight?" Mrs. Henley asked, "or shall I prepare something light for the conservatory?" "The conservatory, please," Margaret replied. "I want to finish reviewing the applications for the new arts scholarship program before tomorrow's meeting." As the sun set over the estate grounds, Margaret settled into the glass-walled room where Theodore had grown orchids and listened to classical music during his final years. The space had become her favorite retreat, a place where she could work on foundation business while surrounded by the beauty he had cultivated with such patient care. The scholarship application spread across the mahogany desk told stories of young people struggling to balance dreams with financial reality, working multiple jobs while pursuing education that could transform their lives. Margaret recognized herself in many of their essays, remembering the exhaustion and hope that had defined her own journey from community college student to successful attorney. Theodore had understood that struggle because he had witnessed it firsthand in the woman he loved. His children had never learned that lesson because they had never been required to face genuine hardship or work for anything they received. Perhaps someday they would develop the character he had always hoped to see in them, but that growth would have to come through their own efforts rather than inherited advantage. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 9 o'clock, its bronze voice echoing through rooms that now felt truly like home. Margaret closed the scholarship files and walked to the window that overlooked the memorial garden where Theodore's ashes rested beneath a simple granite stone surrounded by the roses he had loved. In the distance, she could see lights in the modest apartments where his children now lived their reduced but honest lives. Perhaps someday they would understand that their father's greatest gift had not been money or property, but the chance to discover who they truly were when stripped of unearned privilege. Perhaps they would even thank her for having the courage to implement the difficult love that Theodore had been unable to deliver himself. For now, it was enough that justice had been served with precision rather than vengeance, that worthy young people would receive opportunities that might change their lives, and that Theodore's legacy lived on in ways that honored his values rather than perpetuating the entitlement he had come to despise. What did you think about Margaret's journey from dismissed outsider to powerful force for justice? Have you ever witnessed someone underestimate another person so completely that it led to their own downfall? I'd love to hear your thoughts about this story of patience, planning, and the ultimate triumph of character over entitlement in the comments below. Margaret turned off the conservatory lights and walked through halls that belonged to her not through manipulation or seduction, but through the freely given love of a good man who had recognized her worth when others saw only surface appearances. The mansion settled into peaceful silence around her, its rooms filled with memories of love, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing virtue finally rewarded.